Hi and welcome to this week's lecture. My name is Dr. Daniel Kadlec and I'm a lecturer at Edith County University in Perth, Australia. On top of that, I'm an experienced strength and conditioning coach, mainly for team sport athletes. And today, in this lecture, we're looking into what makes athletes fast. What are the differences and intricacies of faster sprinters? And then, what are some approaches to increase the maximum sprinting velocity of our athletes? And how to prepare them for such demands.
In the first part, we are looking at the key determinants of attaining high maximum sprinting velocity, and this knowledge will then help our understanding of what to do and what not to do in order to sprint fast. We'll start this lecture with a small recap of the basic laws of physics or Newton's laws, as these laws lay the underpinning foundation of how we interpret motion and help us understand how forces affect movement and performance. Have a quick read to refresh your understanding here and pause the slide. Okay, so the first law, the law of inertia, determines that an object will not change its state of motion unless a force is applied to it. The second law of motion, the law of acceleration, gives us an equation which we all know. Mathematically, we can write it as F equals m times a, where F is the force applied, m is the mass of the object, and a is the acceleration of the object. And this is something more tangible for us coaches, as it determines that objects change their motion when we do something to them. And the important word here in this description is proportional. So the rate and magnitude of force expressed will determine the rate and magnitude of change in motion, or in other words, the acceleration of an object or an athlete. The third law, the law of action and reaction, says that the action of two bodies upon each other are always equal and always opposite in direction. For example, the ground reaction force you express when you stand to counter gravity is the same magnitude as the gravity pulls you in. Okay, back to sprinting, and let's start with the end. What do we need to sprint fast? What are biomechanical determinants of being able to achieve high accelerations and top-end velocities? In the first part of the lecture, we'll briefly look at the impact of body mass, or rather functional versus non-functional mass. But then we'll dig into the importance of force and the magnitude of force expression, the role of ground contact time, and then the intricacies of force orientation, where I'll give you my perspective on the discussion of vertical versus horizontal forces. Fat birds don't fly. I know, a touchy subject in 2023 and beyond with certain cohorts, but physics and gravity cannot be neglected. Body composition obviously affects our mass and therefore how much force we need to express to induce a change in motion. Reducing non-functional mass is one way about it, which is probably the easiest way to get faster, more agile, more athletic, but this is a whole other topic. Increasing functional mass in the right places can also be considered when programming for our athletes. Or, on the other hand, understanding where we do not want to increase muscle mass is also of importance. So, talking about upper body versus lower body and the ratio of muscle mass we want to increase, but then also on a more sophisticated level, can we increase muscle mass in terms of proximal and distal within a segment, and how this might affect then segment inertias and therefore the moments required to accelerate segments in the right direction. So what are things faster runners do differently compared to others? Well, they can produce much higher stance average vertical force in relation to their body mass. Associated with that, peak forces are also much higher compared to slow runners. And with the higher force production, they can generate the vertical impulse they need much faster to A, overcome gravity, and B, to re-accelerate the center of mass. And because the net vertical impulse they need to get off the ground at a given speed is constant, they have shorter ground contact times and then also slightly better stride frequencies. And when we look at this slow-mo video of our 11.2 meters per second sprinter, so a pretty elite runner, we see the associated force time curves with the vertical and the horizontal component for each foot strike. And this gives us a nice reflection of how and when forces are generated during a max velocity sprinting task, which is usually pretty hard to conceive when we look at this in real time and they're just flying across the track. So when we look at the entire force time curve of faster sprinters compared to sub-elite and regular PE students, we see a shift in the vertical ground direction force towards a more asymmetrical force time curve biased towards the early stance phase. And there is a strong positive relationship between top speeds and the average force applied during the first half of the stance period. And essentially no relationship of the average force being applied during the second half of the stance. So being fast or being able to achieve high sprinting velocities is dependent on how much force the system can handle upon initial foot strike and the early phases of the entire ground contact phase. When we then differentiate vertical and horizontal forces during max velocity, which is commonly done when analyzing such motions, we see a common trend. Vertical forces plateau before we reach maximum velocity, and horizontal forces continue to increase, and you can see what the common interpretation will be with that. Horizontal forces are then surely associated with achieving higher speeds rather than vertical forces. However, I argue that it is the entire opposite of what's going on. This just describes what the limiting capacities are. When you get to about 70 or 80% of your max velocities, your vertical forces cannot go up anymore, purely because contact time is continuing to shrink, because you're going faster and faster, and you don't have the capacity to access vertical forces any faster. Think of the force length relationship and the force velocity relationship. So that just describes that your acceleration comes to a halt, and the increase in horizontal forces isn't a strategy you use to get faster. It's a sign that you're about to reach your physical capacities and your acceleration comes to a halt. However, this slight increase in braking force and on the other side propulsive impulse can be a strategy to stay fast for longer if you have the skills and capacities to do so. When we model the limb as a spring, we need to load the spring during the initial ground contact or initial foot strike, and that's your braking force, so the spring can then release the energy in the later phases of the ground contact phase. And with shorter and shorter ground contact times, the amount of force needs to increase, so the necessary impulse to load the spring is still sufficient. So there's a benefit in increasing braking forces and while still equalizing the propulsive impulse on the other side. But this is a non-infinite strategy, as we cannot just slam our foot in the ground harder and harder and hope that it'll work. We need to have the appropriate capacities and the skills to do so. So when we look at the right hand example, the top blue curve indicates higher braking and propulsive impulses, and the associated velocity curve at the bottom shows a greater velocity change during stance. And this strategy helps me to get more time on the ground as I slow myself down during this ground contact time to then be able to apply sufficient forces, but I still have to have the capacity and the skill to generate a high takeoff velocity again. However, there's a discrepancy in the magnitude of force and the time of braking to propulsion at max velocity. And this braking to propulsion ratio changes with increasing sprinting velocities. So it's actually a non-uniform spring-like behavior, because we need to load the spring harder and faster at or towards max velocity to get the same release, sufficient horizontal impulse, because we slowed ourselves down in the initial phase of the ground contact time. And at one point, we just cannot load the spring anymore because we don't have sufficient leg extension capacities and also the skills to apply this force in such brief moments. So this part was about understanding the differences between running fast and being actually a fast sprinter from a mechanical point of view, and the application of mechanics, and then also identify limiters on performance or sprint performance and potential solutions to lift the ceiling, so to speak. So again, we need those high forces, especially during initial stance, to be able to load the spring, your leg, and be able to tolerate this during very short contact times. So we can then release the energy during the second half of the stance, which then is associated with our propulsive impulse, our horizontal impulse. So with the next part, we'll now look into a discussion of force vector orientation and the vertical versus horizontal forces discussion on sprint performance and understand what the cause and what the results is, which therefore informs our decision making when planning and designing our strength training for our athletes in order to get faster. But first, we must understand the difference between correlation and causation. And this is often misunderstood because it can be very complex. Although the two concepts are related, they are not the same thing. And this is what's often happening when talking about vertical and horizontal forces and their importance for sprinting performance. To recap, correlation is a statistical measure that indicates the degree to which two variables are related to one another. When two variables are correlated, it means that changing one variable is associated with changes in the other variable, but it does not necessarily mean that one variable causes the other to change. And causation, on the other hand, is a relationship between one event, the cause, and the second event, the effect, where the second event is understood as the consequence of the first. And causation implies that a change in one variable directly causes a change in the other variable. I hope this made somewhat sense. So now we know how to do the basics right. So be able to express high leg extension forces and be able to tolerate their application within small amounts of time, so ground contact time. But there's a popularity with research highlighting the importance of horizontal force application during running or sprinting, which, however, as I'd like to emphasize, is an incomplete and misleading interpretation of the data, and based on that, suboptimal coaching recommendations are drawn. The role of leg extension force in sport skills like acceleration, max velocity, change direction is entirely determined by fundamental mechanics, i.e., how big is my force vector and where's my center of pressure in relation to the center of mass. However, we've seen that there is a high variability between leg extension force, so your squat 1 RM, and performance over several distances or different change direction tasks. As in, we often see a small to moderate correlation coefficient between your leg extension ability measured by a squat IMTP or ISO squat, and then your acceleration Vmax change direction performance. And then it is concluded that the strength, or rather maximum strength, isn't that important, which is a flawed conclusion, because what the correlation coefficient tells us is the athlete's ability to utilize their strength within these specific tasks. And this correlation differs based on the population you're testing. So how effective are they in expressing their force within a certain task? And this gives us a different coaching perspective and training implications. And those applied studies, however, do not answer the question as to the role of leg strength and athletic performance, as we have to account two things which those studies do not. First, the raw physical leg extension capacity, and second, the skill of effectively utilizing this during athletic movements. So just because you have something doesn't mean you do use it, but if you don't have it, you can't use it. And these papers argue that the skill of horizontal force production is more important than the magnitude of force vector that an athlete is able to produce. And this is likely not a question to be answered by this kind of data set. Or in other words, your ability to express leg extension force entirely determines performance in certain movements. So let's look at this example of sprint acceleration now. Consider an athlete with fixed leg extension capabilities. So that's your gray arrow in this picture. And the amount of forward lean is determined by the magnitude of your leg extension force. That's basic mechanics. So more leg extension force available, so a bigger arrow, the gray arrow, means that the force vector can be tipped further forward while still permitting enough vertical force to overcome gravity. So the overall force magnitude needs to be larger if you want to be able to orient this vector more forward. So leaning forward without having sufficient leg extension strength will risk you to fall over, because we just can't ignore and neglect gravity. So what are the implications we are getting from this? First, your limit angle of forward lean is set by your leg extension force magnitude. And second, your level of skill describes how close you get to your own limit of angle of lean. And that gives us different coaching and training implication based on what the athletes struggle with. Are they strong, but aren't they able to express this force within certain tasks? Or are they limited by their leg extension capacities? And based on that, we can then set different training programs to help them get faster. So although it was thought that only vertical forces are affected by inertia and gravity, horizontal forces were also affected, because force is a vector after all. So the orientation of force is correlated. But what about the impulses? So the area under the curve. What about the timing of the magnitude? Can one influence the other? And although we can decompose and reduce force into its vertical, horizontal, and also lateral components to simplify the statistical analysis, epistemologically, force is still one vector, and therefore we need to be cautious, very cautious, when reading and interpreting such research suggesting that one is more important than the other. And when we consider the literature, remember the kinetic chain when trying to understand cause and effect. And here's another example that should sharpen our understanding of what to train. When looking at kinematics of baseball pitching, so joint velocities, we see here the black line that wrist velocity of the throwing arm exceeds the velocity of any other joint and is also highly correlated with throwing velocity. But, well, hopefully no one would argue that the key to throwing fast is to train your wrist flexors, right? Yet the same justification is used when wanting to improve the quote-unquote magic horizontal force production. So what is the cause and what is the effect? Let's not be fooled by popularity. Welcome to the second part of this lecture, where we'll be looking at the training implications on how to get athletes faster based on what we saw in the first part of the lecture. While this isn't going to be an extensive list of training methods and training exercises, I want you rather to be able to understand how different approaches can be used to improve certain abilities, or rather how different approaches can be used to prepare athletes for the high demands of sprinting at maximum velocities, and how this ceiling can be pushed further and further. The other point I want to touch upon is highlighting the difference between skills and abilities, something we've covered over the last 2 lectures. One is an innate trait and hard to change, while the other is more receptive to training and exposure to deliberate practice and seeing meaningful changes over time. And at the same time, we have this inherent assumption in the SNC profession for the need to change or improve someone's sprinting mechanics at all costs, as it is often suggested, but in reality, this is rather hard to achieve. So what is our end game? What do we need to prepare our athletes for? And what external kinetics occur when sprinting at max velocities or during a max acceleration performance? If we look at those 2 figures here on this slide, we see the force time characteristics during acceleration on your left and max velocity on your right. The first thing we want to consider is the magnitude of force that is required during those movement tasks. In this example, the athlete is expressing force between 3 to 4 times their body weight on one foot in less than 0.15 up to 0.1 of a second. And if we take our dynamic correspondence head on and consider what exercises we can utilize to directly overload any of those characteristics, well, the list becomes very thin. So descriptive information like this can be very valuable to inform our decision making or about where to prepare our athletes towards to. Another example is this table showing more in-depth information on the differences between early and late acceleration in sprinters. So your first step out of block versus your foot strike at around 35 meters. And it breaks it down into the vertical component and then the braking and propulsive components, which again is great for descriptive information, but not to infer cause and effect relationships. And it also shows how little time we have, especially in the propulsive phase, to actually apply force, especially considering we are in a biomechanically compromised position to effectively express high force magnitudes once our hips or center of mass traveled over our foot or the center of pressure. So enforcing a triple extension pattern of every joint might compromise our ability to be fast or become faster. So much about the magic horizontal force muscles, right? So onto sprinting kinematics. How can sprinting kinematics inform our exercise selection if you want to overload any of those characteristics presented here on this slide? What I want to focus on here now is the stride frequency and the stride length. Especially during max velocity sprinting, we hit a stride frequency up to 5 hertz, or in other words, we take up to 5 steps in 1 second. So just consider the joint angle velocities here. And again, from a dynamic correspondence point of view, how do we overload this? In combination with stride length, we can then see athletes covering well over 10 meters within 1 second. And now just pause the presentation and consider how big the room is you're sitting in right now and how much 10 meters is. Still something I feel we need to remind ourselves of more often, of the brute forces that act while sprinting at max velocity and how it looks like once we hit max velocities. So what happens from a muscular perspective when we are approaching max velocities, and why attaining max velocities offers a unique stimulus, a stimulus that is hard to achieve with other exercises and training methods. Let's have a look at this figure where you see the joint moments for the hip, knee, and ankle, when running at different velocities from 3.5 meters per second up to almost 9 meters per second. And with increasing speeds, so when we go from left to right, you rely more and more on the muscular performance around your hip joint in flexion and extension, and the knee flexors, as indicated by the increased flexion and extension moments. And the knee extensors and the ankle joint do not equally increase, as its function, especially during max velocity, is more likely to be a modulator of stiffness than actively contributing to propulsion, as we keep those joints relatively straight during the ground contact. So the hip to knee moment ratio increases with speed. And with those moment changes, there are associated shifts in muscle functions as you move across running speeds. You can see from this figure here that as running speed increases, certain muscle or muscle groups need to produce more and more force once you get it faster. And those include the hip flexors, hip extensors, and knee flexors. Whereas the vastus group and the ankle plantar flexors don't change much, which again indicates that they work more as a stiffness modulator. So in summary, you'll likely need a regular exposure to maximum velocities in order to trigger those desired adaptations and increase in strength in those specific regions, which is just not possible at sub-maximum speeds or other training methods. Coming back to this overview, let's talk about how to affect or improve any of those determinants. How can we work on those qualities in order to improve sprinting performance eventually? Well, we do know how to train each of these in isolation, and this is covered in other parts of this or other lectures, especially your resistance training methods and plyometric training approaches, which will consequently have an effect on the magnitude and the orientation of the force vector as discussed earlier. But what I want to highlight with the last part of this lecture is the unique demands of maximum velocity sprinting and how to exploit this as an adequate training stimulus instead of thinking about how to improve these listed determinants in isolation. Here I want to discuss this simulation study highlighting the effect of increasing specific strength upon sprint velocity. And the authors of this paper looked at what happens when muscle strength, muscle fascicle length, muscle intrinsic maximum shorting speed, so your muscle fiber type 1 to 2 ratio, and tendon compliance is computationally modified in a sprint model. And if we look at this figure, we see that maximum sprinting speed was most sensitive to changes in leg muscle strength, as indicated by the slope of the red data points. So when we go from negative 25% or from a decrease of 25% of this property to an increase up to 25%. So being able to increase muscle force expression at specific force length and force velocity relationships seems to have the biggest influence. At each instant of the simulated sprint cycle, the force developed by each muscle was directly proportional to the value of its peak force. Thus, an increase in muscle strength produced proportionally higher peak muscle forces during the sprint and consequently a higher maximum sprinting velocity. And while this is just a simulation study and a model, it gives us good insight as to what to prioritize with our work. Specific increases in muscle force expression. Let's now look at joint and system stiffness, as this contributes to our ability to tolerate shorter and shorter ground contact times, which is essential when wanting to be fast or get faster. So faster runners have higher average force expression and can access these forces faster. So where's this coming from when considering different joints? And this paper looked at how joint and system stiffness changes when going from 70 to 80 to 90 to 100% of maximum sprinting velocity. To start with, stiffness was calculated by dividing the change in force by the change in length, or in this example, your average joint stiffness is the change in joint moment divided by the change in joint angle during this ground contact time. So the first thing that is of interest is the lack of change in ankle stiffness across all speeds. So even during sub-maximum speeds, the ankle is relatively constant in what it's doing. But the line above tells us that increases in system stiffness come from other joints, the knee. But the large standard deviation shows us that the strategies differed between individuals when approaching your maximum sprinting velocity. So only if we achieve 100% of our maximum sprinting velocity, we are testing our ability to stiffen up the system to tolerate shorter and shorter ground contact times, which again is unlikely to happen when we are running at sub-maximum speeds or with other training approaches and methods. So sprinting is an extremely complex motor skill involving repeated rapid switching on and off of practically every single muscle in your body. And this happens so incredibly fast. So especially considering our stride frequency and how fast our legs are turning over, especially when we are going faster and faster. And in this figure, you see the EMG activity of our key muscles when sprinting and how synchronously they switch on and off. And this ability needs to be trained to make it as effective and efficient as possible. And this shouldn't be no news to you. So putting this all into context on what methods to use in order to increase our sprinting performance, although I think our justification for or against certain methods, in this example, resistance training only versus sprinting only, will always be a context-dependent continuum, and the answer most likely isn't either or. However, right now, my best guess would be if you want to get faster, to never neglect sprints, or in other words, only focusing on gym and getting barbell strong, gym strength. Because if you don't sprint, you won't transfer the increased capacity that you acquired with your resistance training methods to an increase in speed or an improvement in your motor skill of sprinting and accelerating. So we know that weights can improve your sprinting performance or leg extension strength, and then in the next step, your sprinting performance. But does the speed or exposing yourself to maximum sprinting velocities increase your weights or rather your leg extension force abilities? And here are 3 studies that compared either resistance training or plyometric protocol only against sprints only and its effect on leg extension strength. And all of these studies showed a significant increase in your lower body strength after only sprinting. But of course, all of those applied studies have certain limitations, especially if we just qualitatively observe the magnitude of improvement and the starting point. So the sprinting group usually was the weaker group to start with. But then again, if we consider the specific adaptation to imposed demands idea, we do see increases in squat performance after only sprinting. So like 2 different skills and how they still affect each other. So something to bear in mind when deciding on what to do in terms of your exercise and method selection to improve sprinting speed. And here you have 2 studies that I can recommend to further develop your understanding of how to become faster. Both studies are of longitudinal design and are more observational. Both follow elite athletes for several months and up to 2 years, which is usually very rare to find in the published literature. It's a relative easy but extensive read, and what I want you to focus on is assessing the training blocks and the respective training content where they showed increases in sprint performance. Something worthwhile discussing later on in the discussion board. I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on this and where you sit in terms of how you program for your athletes when you want to increase their sprinting performance. Okay, how do we translate those findings into our practice? Well, not sprinting is not sprinting, and we know that maximum velocities are needed to get faster and trigger those adaptations that we want. But I still often hear that this occurs at around 50 to 60 meters, as we see with elite 100-meter sprinters. However, in team sports, maximum velocity is likely to be reached much, much earlier. And Clark and colleagues showed that field sport athletes need about 20 meters to reach maximum velocity from a static start, as you see in the table on your bottom right. And then we need some extra distance after that to get that max velocity exposure in. And from a practical standpoint, almost all athletes will already start to decelerate way before they reach the set distance or the set cone. So it's okay to lie to them and set the cones about 10% further from what you want them to sprint. So the next one, we need intent to reach those 100% intensities and velocities. So how do we make sure our athletes put also 100% effort into each sprint? That can be another challenge in our applied setting. So my best recommendation or my best experience is there needs to be competition. It's hard to see someone sprinting at 100% on its own in training, but against someone else, they'll compete. But this comes also down to your coaching ability, relationship building, and the buy-in you have. So in order to be able to repeat maximum velocities on consecutive trials, we need to have enough rest in between, which makes sense, right? And the general rule of thumb that per 10 meter of max sprint effort, you need to have at least 1 minute of rest still holds true. Also, as long as they're breathing heavy and hard, they're not ready yet. And this can be another challenging part, as most of them, especially team sport athletes, are just not used to have a rest and do nothing. Another common training method is resisted sprinting. And without going into too much details, there's a good amount of evidence supporting its effectiveness on acceleration performance, especially the heavier loads we use. However, this is often referred to an overload of the hip extensors to increase, quote unquote, the horizontal force output, which is unlikely to be true as we've just increasing forward lean, and so it becomes more of a squatting pattern. Anyway, it seems to work in reality. But I'd like to bring up a question. Is it really a mechanical overload or maybe more so a coordinative overload? Or maybe both? Because every time I prescribe heavy resisted sprints and then pair them with free sprints, athletes seem to struggle on the first reps or during the first steps of the first free sprint. Maybe they're just learning to use a more efficient movement pattern in terms of differential learning and also your practice variability when we're setting up our drills, which we've touched upon during our last lecture. And another big topic with sprints is the fear of hamstring injuries. However, if we want to make our athletes as resilient and robust as possible, sprints or the exposure to maximum sprinting velocities are most likely a good tool. And it has been demonstrated that sprints elicit the highest EMG activity compared to your typical hamstring exercises for all hamstring muscles. And when we look at long-term effects, sprinting seems to be as good as just a Nordic hamstring curl intervention for eccentric strength gains, plus you get faster, especially if you consider the effect sizes of both interventions. And on top of that, no one is forcing you to choose either or in reality. And of course, most of us will likely use a complementary approach when dealing or training with athletes. And if implemented progressively and continuously, hamstring injuries tend to be at its lowest when we consider the number of weekly exposures to maximum sprint velocities. And now some further considerations and assumptions that are often circulated in our profession when it comes to speed development. And we have some studies demonstrating a significant correlation of any of those structures and sprinting performance. And also some intervention studies that showing the efficacy of improving any of those capacities with isolated single joint exercises and sprint performance. But are we really overloading these structures with single joint big toe curls? We've seen how much force or torque those structures generate or express during maximum sprinting velocities. And I think it's most unlikely that you can overload these structures in a gym somehow that manifests in a meaningful transfer for sprint performance. I argue it's the effect of sprinting fast and sprinting fast often and not the other way. And also consider how weak and untrained you have to be in the first place that improving your big toe flexor strength improves your sprinting performance. So let's recap this lecture. Physics govern movement and sprinting. And after this lecture, you should be able to answer the following questions. What are the key determinants of fast sprinting? How do vertical and horizontal forces relate to sprinting performance? How does muscle function change when approaching max velocity? And are you able to describe methods to increase sprint performance in the long run and give certain consideration around the pros and cons of certain methods?